Shalom. I am Rabbi Robbie Harris, and once again, I welcome you to a video podcast in our series, Shabbat, From Here to Eternity. Now, in last week's episode, filmed only 5 minutes ago, we discussed the 39 prohibited activities on Shabbat, the milachot. And a milacha we defined as an act that demonstrates human mastery over our environment. It's precisely those kinds of things that the halakha, Jewish law, forbids us from doing on Shabbat. Now I can hear some of you saying, well, why should I not do things that I want to do? Why can't I determine my observance of Shabbat or lack thereof? Who are you, Robbie Harris, to tell me the Jewish tradition demands we do X or Y or don't do X or Y? My response is that what we said at the end of last week's episode, it's kind of an irony, but by not doing certain things that are those things characterized by the melachot, we free up ourselves to spend a day that's filled with all sorts of positive activities that we otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. For example, a day in which I don't go to the office, I don't do my typical work, I don't drive far away from home, I don't, the phone is not ringing, the TV is not on, the iPod is disconnected. All of a sudden, I'm back to nature. I have the opportunity to spend time speaking to my family and friends, walking out in the world, doing those kinds of things which are natural, human, as opposed to technological and work-oriented. So there is that tendency that we have, especially in America, makes me angry if somebody's going to tell me what to do. And especially as a television producer once told me, especially if you're from New York, you don't like people telling you what to do. But even in Baltimore. The point here that I'm advocating is that we consider what kind of life we can have when we don't do all those weekday work-related things one day of the week. Now, it's true that the subject of today will take us into a traditionally observed Shabbat, as the rabbis have imagined it over the countless generations for the last 2,000 years. It's possible to imagine just the kind of... I need to start. Now, the subject of today's episode is going to be taking us through a typical Shabbat and how the rabbis imagined that we would observe it. Now, we're going to move from last week's subject, which is all the things you're not supposed to do on Shabbat, to this week's subject, which is what you are supposed to do. We're going to think of the Shabbat as the rabbis mandated its observance and its celebration during the 24 hours, 25 hours of the Shabbat. And we're going to see how to do a traditional Shabbat. But it could be imagined that even if we just didn't do the other things, you would have an idea of the space that is created in our lives to kind of get back to nature when we don't do milachot. Now, because we actually spent 2 sessions on the biblical Shabbat at the beginning of our series when we had originally budgeted only 1 session, today's episode will combine 2 episodes originally planned for separate sessions into 1 longer session. So without further ado, we will now commence with Where Did God Command Us? Shabbat in Halakha, and Ata Echad V'Shimcha Echad, You Are One and Your Name is One, a mystical Shabbat experience. Now let us take up the first of these topics. Where did God command us to perform the specific acts, commandments, and customs that are most characteristic of Shabbat? The subject was first raised in the Babylonian Talmud, in Masechet Shabbat, page 23b, if you're scoring at home, about Nerot Chanukah, about Hanukkah lamps. Although it may just have been asked about Nerot Shabbat, Shabbat lamps. The rabbis ask, Mai Mivarech, what kind of blessing should a person say over the Shabbat candles? And the answer is, the one that begins Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam and concludes Asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel, and again in the Talmud it's Chanukah, but we're talking about Shabbat, lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, of course. A person should say, praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to light the Shabbat lamp. Now, tzivanu, the rabbis pick up on that word, and they ask, Hechan tzivanu, where did God command such a thing? Because, of course, it's not in the Torah. Rav Avia Amar, this rabbi said, Melot Tasur. We'll come back to that. And another rabbi, Rav Nehemiah Amar, Sha'al avicha v'yagedcha zikenecha v'yomru lach. Each of these two rabbis in the Talmud has cited a biblical verse. And now we're going to take a look at those two verses to understand how each of them thinks we should associate our, traditional observance of Shabbat with something that may have been intimated in the Torah. The first one, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 and following. The section of the Torah there is a legal section. It's all about the cases that might come before a court that would be difficult for you to decide ahead of time what's going to happen in them. So listen to the Torah's own words. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen and appear before the Levitical priests or the magistrate in charge at that time and present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all the instructions to you. And now the operative verse 11. Al pi Torah asher yorucha va'al mishpat asher yomru lecha ta'aseh lo tasur. Those are the two words that the rabbi cited in the Talmud. Lo tasur mina davar asher yagiru lecha yamin osmol. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announce to you, either to the right or to the left. In other words, for all these observances that we're going to talk about on Shabbat, that have no immediate biblical precedent, things like going to the synagogue, having the Torah read, saying Musaf, whatever you might associate with Shabbat, in addition to lighting candles and Kiddush, how do we know to do those? Lo tasur. The rabbis have told you, it's the Levitical priests and the magistrates in the biblical verse, but the rabbis abrogated that power to themselves. The claim that the rabbis make, of course, is that you should not deviate from anything the rabbis themselves tell you to do. Now, what does this mean? This is an explicit admission that many of our typical Shabbat activities, as I just mentioned, are not rooted directly in the biblical text. They're intimated, the rabbis claim, to the rabbis through what's called Torah shebe'al peh, the oral Torah that was also handed down by God through Moses to the Jewish people at Sinai. It was just never written down. That's the claim that the rabbis make in the Talmud, and in constructing the Shabbat they've constructed, as well as all the other aspects of Rabbinic Judaism, they want us to follow their strictures and their observances. And that's what we should do. Now, the other rabbi, who was Rabbi Nehemiah, he said, cited a different biblical verse. He cited Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7. Sha'al avicha v'yagedcha zikinecha v'yomru lach. Remember the days of old, consider the years of ages past. And here's the verse. Ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, that they will teach you. Remember the days of old, consider the years of ages past. And here's our verse. Ask your father, he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you. Now this rabbi says, kind of like what Tevye says at the beginning of that famous Broadway play, Fiddler on the Roof. He says, it's tradition. We do those things because those are the things that my grandpa did, his grandma did, her grandfather did, all the way back down through the ages. And the Shabbat that has come down to us is traditional, from the Latin traditio, to be passed down. And that's what we do. And it's not justified so much in a legal sense as it is in a familiar or a traditional sense. At any rate, the same question that the rabbis have asked in the Talmud about Shabbat lamps, they could ask about any aspect of Shabbat or indeed of Rabbinic Judaism in general. Where are we commanded to do these things? If it's not explicitly mentioned in the Torah and we still have to do it, well, one of the reasons we should do it is because the rabbis themselves have received it as an oral tradition and developed it in their own way, and we should do it because they've told us to do it, or we can rely on our own sense of tradition, knowing that our grandparents and our grandparents' grandparents all did more or less or more, these kinds of things that through which they identified themselves as Jews, and in specific, our topic, that's how they observed Shabbat. Now, let's go through using this rabbinic question as a segue into a typical Shabbat observance. What goes on a Shabbat, and how does a Jew traditionally fill his or her day during the Shabbat? The plain sense of that verse might be that you cannot have any fire in your houses on Shabbat. The rabbis were not satisfied with that implication, because that would leave you, as I think we once said a few episodes ago, with a dark, cold house eating, uncooked food or leftovers, etc. It would be kind of a miserable experience instead of a joyous experience. So they said no. As long as you light that fire before Shabbat commences, you can enjoy it as long as it continues to burn into Shabbat. And therefore they developed the custom that not only you may light a fire before Shabbat, but you must do it. And to symbolize your adherence to that rabbinic rule, you go out of your way to specifically light a lamp before Shabbat actually begins. For us, it's usually within the last 18 minutes of Friday afternoon before sundown. And we ensure that we've complied with that rabbinic understanding of the biblical verse. We light the Shabbat candles, and therefore we know that, yes, I can continue to heat up my home, the food that I've prepared on Friday afternoon, and enjoy a warm and brightly lit Shabbat in home. And in fact, it's that moment of lighting candles which is such a personal moment filled with our own memories for anyone who observes Shabbat. It's a very intimate moment. In some families, just the women light. In others, the whole family gathers together to light the candles. And usually personal prayers are offered, and it's generally considered to be one of the nicest ways of beginning Shabbat. If you just think of, the classic romantic date, you're going to have that date over a candlelit dinner with wine, maybe a little music, and dress in your nice clothes. I mean, that's really what that Shabbat table and experience is all about. But before we go back home, as it were, we have to talk about Kabbalat Shabbat, because after all, partly we said we were going to do the mystical Shabbat experience. And when I use the term mystical, I don't mean just, sitting on the floor chanting with scented candles and a dark room. I don't mean that kind of mysticism. I mean two things by the term mysticism. The normal Jewish mysticism. Normal mysticism is a phrase made famous by the great scholar Rabbi Max Kedushin of blessed memory. And he wrote, there's things that the rabbis have built into our lives in a day-to-day basis which are really mystical, and we just sort of get used to them in small doses. But when we talk about Kabbalat Shabbat, we're really talking about mysticism with a capital M, or Kabbalah, and I'm thinking in specific about the mystics of Tzfat, Safed in English, in the north of Israel in the 17th century CE, a mere few hundred years ago. They developed a custom not to simply begin their Shabbat prayers with the recitation of Psalm 92, Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat, but to precede that with all sorts of additional psalms that are built into our prayer book today, as well as poetic compositions such as the famous Lecha Dodi, that through the recitation of which they greet Shabbat. Now, for us, there's great music written to that. That might be the favorite part of the service on Friday night for us. We do a lot of singing, and that's all great. When the Kabbalists wrote those compositions and added those particular recitations to the liturgy, they were thinking mystically. They were thinking, how do these prayers express our awareness of the internal workings of the divine presence? Now, more than that on a television podcast of this kind, I'm not going to say, but I encourage you, reaching off screen here for a moment, to pick up this book, My People's Prayer Book. I originally got it off the library shelf here at the seminary because it has a very colorful cover. This one, of course, is not there, as you see. But My People's Prayer Book is a wonderful series published by Jewish Lights Publishing with traditional prayers, modern commentaries, introductions, explanations, all of which were edited by Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman. I really recommend, if you're interested in anything to do with Jewish liturgy, pick up that series. It must be 8 or 10 volumes by now. I don't get 10% of the sales. But in particular about Shabbat and the mystical experience that we're describing, there's a wonderful essay written by Rabbi Reuven Kimmelman about the mystical origins of prayers like Lecha Dodi. The rest of the Kabbalat Shabbat service is really just a normal ma'ariv, or evening service. And other than the fact that the Amidah that is recited is a special Amidah for Shabbat, there's very little other that's different. Let's go back home at this point. What goes on at home? The Men's Club, the Federation of Men's Clubs, years ago put out a series called the Shabbat Seder. Now, the word Seder, of course, comes to us from Passover. There's a set order to a meal on that festival day. They thought that there was the same kind of concept that they could apply to Shabbat, and it was, I thought, a very clever program. It's probably 20 years old already by now. But what is this Shabbat Seder, this home service, all about? Well, the rough term for it is the Kiddush, but the Kiddush itself is only one component of a series of liturgies and songs that we do. And it begins first with the famous Shalom Aleichem. We sing Shalom Aleichem when we gather around at our Shabbat table. And it's a funny kind of prayer if you think about it, because it's a prayer that you're really addressing to angels, not to God. Something that we're not really supposed to do in Judaism, but there you have it. We do it. Take a look at an English translation of it sometime. But it's that song, Shalom Aleichem, is rooted in a midrash, which basically says, as a person comes home from synagogue on Friday, as that person enters the home, 2 angels have accompanied him, the good angel and the bad angel. And basically, if the good angel sees that the house is clean for Shabbat and well lit and there's nice food and everybody's dressed nicely and it's just, everything is hunky-dory, that angel says, gives you a blessing. Way to go. But if the person comes home and it's it's noisy and the television is going and the Shabbat table has not been set and people are not really ready for Shabbat or not even interested in Shabbat, then oy vavoy, you get a curse from the other angel. Now, I'm not saying that this really happens. What I'm saying, it's a way of thinking about the prayer-filled moment. By the fact that you are observing Shabbat and singing that song, you're assuming that your Shabbat is ready and in a moment of blessing. And that's the way it should be. And in fact, the next couple of things that happen in the meal are all loving family things or family and friends things, depending on who you are in your life at this particular moment. If you're a family that's blessed with children and the children are present, you bless the children. Now, the commandment to bless children is found in the Torah. There only of boys. You should bless your sons with the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, these are not well-known biblical characters, but one scholar once said to me, why Ephraim and Manasseh? They're the only 2 brothers in the whole Torah that don't fight. Right? It's not Jacob and Esau, not Isaac and Ishmael, not Joseph and his brothers. Ephraim and Manasseh, there's no stories told about them because they were loving brothers and not in conflict. I thought that was a great story. So when we bless our boys, we bless them through those names. And when we bless our girls, it's with reference to Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, the four mothers of Israel. From that, traditionally, Jewish men have recited from the end of the book of Proverbs the poem beginning Eshet Chayil mi yimtza, a woman of valor, who can find her? And many people think that this is a blessing, a biblical poem of blessing for a Jewish husband to his Jewish wife. That's not actually true, although it might be that, and that's a lovely idea. This is a Kabbalistic prayer that all Israel is supposed to bless the Shekhinah, the divine presence, who is thought of in female imagery in the Kabbalistic literature. So in reality, all the people gathered at the table can recite this, not just a Jewish man to his wife, but everybody at the table praising Shabbat and the divine presence of God, thought of in this sense as in feminine imagery. Some people, because of their understanding this is a blessing from a man to a woman, they find biblical phrases, either in Psalms or other sections, that a woman can sing back to a man. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's a new tradition beginning in our age, and check back with us in 50 or 80 years, and we'll see how well that sticks as a Jewish custom. In any case, at that point, you're ready to actually have the Kiddush itself. The word Kiddush, usually translated as sanctification, comes from a biblical sense of needing to make a separation. And in that sense, the word Kiddush, making a distinction between Shabbat and the rest of the week, is really the same word as Havdalah, the similar prayer that we say at Shabbat's conclusion, also over wine and candles, when we mark the end of Shabbat and the beginning of the week. At any rate, we have the Kiddush, we have our wonderful meal. The meal, of course, begins with the 2 loaves of bread, of challah, symbolizing, as we saw earlier, the 2 portions of manna that fell in the wilderness. And there you have it. If you think of it, the wine, the corn, as it were, the biblical wheat or grain that is symbolized in the 2 chalot, and the candles were originally oil lamps. So you have your biblical phrase from the 2nd paragraph of the Shema, your corn, your wine, and your oil, right there on your Shabbat table, symbolizing the eternal Jewish commitment to the land of Israel and its agricultural produce. The Friday night evening experience concludes with traditionally with the singing of songs, Zmirot Shabbat, and we'll be talking more about that in our next and final video podcast. Shalom ulehitraot.